Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. And I just noticed as I hit record, by the time this premieres, we'll be creeping towards the hours of Yom Kippur. So get it in before sunset because I know that our audience of that religious persuasion must be huge, given the news that we cover. But in all seriousness, we'll be away from prying ears for a few hours. But I digress. I digress. But with that being said, we have a bit to cover, more than usual. Nothing really huge, just developments of previous stories. We'll certainly be covering Ukraine, Middle East as well. Those are the two big staples, as I'm sure you were all expecting. And then there's a few minor items. I want to talk about some news out of Europe, some news with the impending BRICS summit, and I also do want to dedicate some time because I think with the way things have progressed domestically within the United States, covering the disaster response of the federal government does warrant some of our time tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, GSP, in order to
Okay.
give us a frontline report in Ukraine.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we're going to start from the north. We don't normally, but we are today. So that isn't really indicative that something huge has happened up there. Kursk has been in a bit of a stalemate. Today, the Russians made some gains, which haven't really happened in about 3 weeks. There have been some tussles. To the west of the Kursk offensive, also generally in Kursk, but um, these are smaller front lines than the ones that people have become familiar with. So the first slide will show you what I'm talking about. To the far left is the area where territory has gone back and forth between Ukrainian and Russian hands. Those are the pale blue gray outlines that you see to the far left, and then moving in the center, you see this long, skinny salient that has developed. That just happened today. It's about 8 kilometers long. The next slide gives you, I think, a better idea of what that is. So this is a crazy flanking maneuver by the Russians. They used three armored personnel carriers. They went toe to toe with some armored vehicles of the Ukrainians and won, and that's why it has happened. We'll see if this salient can hold out. Now the Russians have been lucky. You remember about 2 weeks ago there was a salient in the Toretsk region north of New York. I believe the name of this suburb is called something like Lidanovka, something to that extent, or Leonadova, anyhow, something like that. And it is directly southwest of Toretsk. That has broadened, and we'll see the map for that later. So we'll see if the Ukrainians have enough manpower to cut off this very skinny salient. It is just a road, basically, at the moment. However, it is dangerous. And the reason it's dangerous is you can see it's bifurcating now two areas in the Kursk region. And if it keeps going towards Suja, it will cut off the salient to the north as well as the salient to the right of it. I imagine the Russians will want it'll be easier for them to cut off that in the south at the moment. Again, we'll see. And then the last slide from this series is a close up. Zeleny Shliach. Zeleny Shliach is the name of the town where the advance basically stopped. As you can see to the left of it, there was a small, tiny gain that the Russians had, and beneath it, an area that the Ukrainians took back from them. So the Russians are still persisting in this area. They still haven't increased the amount of men. They don't seem that serious to rush the Kursk, the counter Kursk offensive. And in Russian media, basically, they're saying, you see, this is proof. NATO wants to take over Russia. This is not a joke anymore. We had to, we had to preempt what they were about to do, et cetera, et cetera. So um, it's a good piece of propaganda, and the more that Russia can use the Ukrainian forces here, the less there will be in Donetsk, which is something we've been covering and noticing for weeks now. At the very least, since this offensive started in early August. So now we move into Kupiansk, and you can see that there have been more gains since last week. That salient that you see that is south of Kupiansk is moving ever closer to the Oskol River. The next slide shows you the gains that the Russians made today, and for the first time, they are now in, I believe it's Petropavlovka. This is the area where there was a Russian unit that was surrounded by Ukrainian and Western mercenaries, and they were holed up in a house, and they fought to the end. So I don't think that's lost on some of the units. Kupiansk is an area that is not all that far from Poltava, so it's easier to, like, it's one of those areas on the front line where the Ukrainians are not short of manpower. They're not short of manpower in Kursk either, right? And so, in Donetsk, I think it's safe to say now that the Russians are outnumbering the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are depending upon basically FPV drones, what is it, UAF? Um, the drones that drop grenades, and then they're the drones that smash into armored vehicles or people. So that is what they're depending on. And of course, artillery to slow down the Russian advance. And I have to say, there are stories that are emerging both in the Kupiansk area and in the Pokrovsk area. There's a small town or city. It's not really like a little town. It does have an industrial area. This is that Novogorodovka that the Russians took in about 3 days. So um, there is video footage. I think this particular story, I'm not going to get into story after story, but it was so heinous, it has to be brought up. This was, I believe, in the Kursk area. So at least two Ukrainian soldiers barge into a house, and they ask the people inside, which was a man and I think his father, who was in a wheelchair, to get out. And as they do, they shoot them dead. And they're basically begging them, please don't shoot, please don't shoot. The reason we found this video is the guys who did this. Eventually, the Russians liquidated them. Another story in the Pokrovsk area is Ukrainians dressed up as or pretending to be Russian soldiers. Remember that this town fell back in August, and essentially the people coming out of their homes, and because they greeted them warmly under the pretense that they were Russian soldiers, they were executed. So just that kind of shit behavior that's so common
Oh,
with
there's a
the
number of these
Ukrainians.
stories out of
Oh yeah,
Kursk. I mean, going back, one of the first stories that came out about this, just to revisit that, was the opening fire upon a family of four.
that's right.
The two parents, early mid 20s, two young children, pregnant wife. They kill her. I think they killed one of the children actually,
Yeah.
if memory serves, and injured the other two. So, like I said, from day one, that's what this has been.
Yes. Yes. They got tired of killing civilians in Belgorod, and yeah. So more of that. I thought it was shocking. So we should mention it. Um, now, So that's the Kupiansk area. The next one you can see is a close up. I don't know if people want to get a better look at it, of Petropavlovka. The Russians have sort of captured about, oh, I would say about 20-25% of it. We'll see whether there is enough rubble for them to hold on to this area, right? Because many of these places are bombed to smithereens. They are ruins. They are um, skeletons of what they used to be. And I'll get into that a little bit later with some other areas where there was an assumption that there was a big Russian advance in the Seversk region, which turned out not to be the case. But it kind of was, but it kind of wasn't. I'll explain. So, and then the last slide for the Kupiansk area is basically that salient I was talking about that has almost reached the Oskal River. There is one road linking this area, and you can see what the Russians are trying to do here. They're trying to separate the North Kupiansk from the South Kupiansk territory, and they're going to use the river basically as a shield for their movements. Um, yes, and so the next slide is uh, in that area that I was just talking about. It's a bit of a blow up. You can see it. Yep. And then now we get into Seversk, which is quite a bit south from there. It's close to Lysychansk. It is north of Bakhmut. So you can see in this slide the areas that the Russians have captured today and the day before. Now we saw rumors, I think today or yesterday, that the Russians had reached Grigorievka, which is the next town over. There is video footage of a Russian soldier going there, planting so one of these towns, they planted a flag and then just left. Okay. The town, there's nothing left of it. So there is no place to hide. There is no place to dig in and create forward positions. You can see in the close up that Grigorovka is in the gray zone. Beneath it is the blue area. Now, there are Ukrainian soldiers in and around these areas. They are in a forward position. That yellow squiggly line is the main front line. That is the fortified front line. It's not the forward front line, right? But it is from here and in between the area where the Russian advanced that you have the concentration of Ukrainian soldiers, right? And so the other area where there was an advance is Verhi Okamyanske, to the south. That is another area that I think the extent of it was exaggerated. It's in here that a drone was used to drop a flag to create the illusion. So the Russians are doing some propaganda points here, okay? Much like the way we saw the Ukrainians doing, especially back in the spring and summer of 2022. It could be to throw them off. This is an area that's very well fortified. The Ukrainians have been very successful here. It has only been in 2024 that the Russians have been able to retake some of these areas. Like, remember the town that kept going back and forth, Bilogorovka. Bilogorovka was an area that went back and forth many times, but usually the Ukrainians held on to it. Now, the Russians took it back a few months ago, but it's been difficult to press further. Of course, you see the forest above them, and most of that is with Ukrainian troops, or we suppose. Now, as I said, some of these towns, there are no Ukrainians in those towns. They are immediately outside, 500 meters, a kilometer, 2 kilometers away. Their purpose is basically as they're forward looking. They're there to notice a Russian advance, and then firepower will come from the yellow outline where the fortified positions are. Okay. And if they break through, there's another line of defense behind Seversk. Seversk itself is in a low ground. Immediately to the west is a high ground. And the place where you see the yellow squiggly line, that's a high ground too. So Seversk is kind of in a bit of a gully. It's not that deep, but that's the best word I can come up with at the time. So anyways, that is Seversk. You can pop the next slide of Seversk just so people get a better idea. Yeah, so that's what it looks like. You can see that they've just moved out of Belagorovka. The next frontline news is Chasov Yar. And there's been some small gain. Chasov Yar has been an area that's been quiet for 6-7 weeks. It was quite active before. It's an area that the Russians, in a way, I mean, it was very well fortified. The Ukrainians fought very well here. Given their lack of an air force, because the Russians here were pounding this area in the spring and early summer with fab bombs. You can go to the next slide and we'll see how much the Russians have taken. They've advanced a little bit, and part of the reason they advanced, like, again, notice the fortifications. In this slide, you're seeing those yellow fortifications. They are along a river. Not a very deep river, not a very wide river, but a river nonetheless, which would make it difficult for some armored units to get across. What the Ukrainians did, instead of waiting for the Russians to cross and then attack them, they attacked them while they were crossing. And the Russians were able to gain a foothold in Chasov Yar proper. After, to the east, they had already taken the micro district of Chasov Yar. So if the Russians want to take Chasov Yar, like, I think they could if they wanted to, because they've captured more than half of it now. If you include the micro district as part of it, or, like, let's say half, right? Now, Konstantinovka is a much bigger town, and it's right next to it, and Chasov Yar is almost like a suburb of Konstantinovka. So the Russians, again, they don't seem to be in any rush. They haven't increased the manpower. What they're doing is they're pressing in every single area along the front line, and that's why every week now you're noticing that they're always making a little gain, another gain, another gain, another gain, and it just keeps going. And that's how they have breakthroughs like Ugledar, for instance. So next we have Toretsk, and there was a big advance the last 48 hours. You can see that the Russians have captured a huge swath of land today and some substantial pieces yesterday. In the bottom left-hand corner, that is Leonidovka that I was talking about earlier. So the Russians are still persisting over there. And but if we focus on Toretsk, and you see where in the central area that they've taken in the pale gray outline, that is the high-rise area, and immediately next to it is the industrial area. So these are probably the two most significant fortifications. Between them, as you can see, are the earth mounds, the giant earth mounds, because this is yet another Donetsk mining town. And they're quite substantial. If the Russians take the mounds, it's done. Toretsk will fall. And judging by the way the Russians are moving through Toretsk pretty quickly, considering how well fortified this town was and how many earthworks there are everywhere, and terracons, as they call them in Ukraine and Russia, the whole place is dotted with terracons, which gives them an edge, being able to overlook any advances, right? So I'm surprised myself how fast the Russians have moved in this area, and it has to be the story of manpower again. And I don't know if the 3rd Assault Azov Brigade Battalion is here. It was in the New York area, in the Leonidovka area, but I haven't heard news about them today and yesterday. So Now we move into Pokrovsk, and you can see a tiny sliver was captured, I believe, yesterday. It's outlined in red, and this is kind of an overview of the northern part of Pokrovsk. And I want to do that because that salient has really thickened now, and it has, a north, a central, and a southern flank to it. It's not. It's no longer just a narrow bridgehead following railroad tracks leading to Pokrovsk. The next slide shows you. Sorry, before we move to the next slide, notice in the top right, left-hand corner, that's Mirnograd. Mirnograd is the twin city of Pokrovsk. They're right next to each other. Um, I don't even know if there's more than a kilometer or two that separates them. So essentially, they're kind of like more or less the same thing. You can look at Mirnograd as um, I don't know, a kind of suburb of Pokrovsk. Okay, so that is, and then the next slide is a blow up of the territory that they took. This is Grodivka. Grodivka is the last sort of urban suburban area before you move into Mirnograd. Now we move to the southern flank of Pokrovsk, and you can see that the Russians have gained some territory around Zoryane. Gurnik is still not taken, but they've expanded their control south of Ukrainsk, as you can see. And that pocket of Ukrainians that were in there, they're being pushed out. And you can see now, if you go to the blow up, you can see a little bit better what the Russians are trying to do here. So they're trying to wedge the Ukrainians um, and forcing them to get out of this pocket. Um, you know, the Russians have done this a few times around Ochertine and west of Ochertine as well. But the Ukrainians, of course, like many times, have orders to stay in these pockets as long as possible, to delay the inevitable as long as possible. And it's also, ironically, what has caused them a manpower shortage. And, Western press now admits that there is a shortage. The Economist, the Financial Times, lots of publications this week have mentioned that not only are they only getting, like, the conscripts are getting only about 5 weeks of training, but that 70% of them die within the first days or weeks after coming to the front. 70%. One Ukrainian soldier that they interviewed said, it's the old, us guys 40 and up, who are there to die as the meat, and it's the young guys that join the ideological units. Exactly what we've been saying on this show, like, for at least 2 years. But now we have Ukrainians who are serving on the front saying it.
Who, not only Ukrainians serving on the front saying it, which we've gotten here and there throughout the war, but mainstream Western publications putting that out there to the
Yeah.
general public. And these are so called reputable institutions like the New York Times, like The Economist. That
Yes.
they are. This isn't some quote unquote right wing crackpot or like left wing, like old left conspiracy theorist type of site. Even though, once again, in my opinion, both of those have track records better than the mainstream media. But point being is,
True.
the mainstream media is talking about this.
Yeah. So the next place I want to focus attention to is the southern front and Ugledar. Now, the slide doesn't really. This slide won't show anything about Ugledar because the Russians have consolidated their gains. They've moved a little further north of Ugledar now, but they're still very close in and around the city. But there was a village that they took in one day. As you can see, it is west of Ugledar, and it's actually a little closer to Velika Novoselka. So this is the Vermevsky ledge that we were talking about in 2023, that's slightly elevated, and then the Russians were slowly pulling out of these villages south of there. Now they've managed to recapture these and go as far as Maka, Makarovka. That's the extent of it. But this town that they've captured, if we go to the next slide, so just south of Konstantin, if you want to, yeah. So that gives you an overview of the Southern Front. The Southern Front has been more or less quiet, except for this gain that I'm talking about now, and one other one that was a total surprise. So go to the next slide. It's a blow up of the village that they captured, Zolota Niva. I don't know if that means like golden Niva. It's like a little piece of land where you grow things. If I'm not mistaken. Anyways, so this was kind of funny. The Russians had a video of their armored units going in here in triumphant, and the Ukrainians have a video of the same place, and 3 armored units get hit. And the Ukrainians say they didn't take anything. We stopped them. And then the Russians say, yeah, we got there. It was super easy. But they don't mention that they lost 3 armored units to get there. So it's kind of funny. It always helps to get both sides of the story to get a fuller picture. And then if the last bit of frontline news is Kamyanka. So the Kamyanka is in Zaporozhye. It's south of Zaporozhye city. It is along the Dnieper. And when I first heard this, so this happened about 3 days ago. We're recording on Thursday night. This will air tomorrow, Friday, late afternoon. And as you can see, the Russians have advanced into the northern part of Kamyanka. This little gulf is what separated North and South Kamyanka. And it's an area where you never hear anything. The only thing I heard in Kamyanka was in like mid 2023 or early 2023, before the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so what happened was, you see that long, skinny outline, the Russians went along this bridge, and you might be thinking, like, how did they get across this bridge? Is there anybody there? Well, the Dnieper, of course, the Novakhovka Dam, that was blown up. And so almost all this area, I know Google has not updated the maps, looks like it's filled with water. It's not. And so the Russians probably crossed over on foot, not necessarily on the bridge, but under the bridge. And today they have expanded yesterday rather, they expanded their zone of control. This could be a very worrying situation for the Ukrainians if it keeps developing. I don't know how serious the Russians are about keeping this. Yes, there might not be any water or very little water, so they could retreat if they had to let go of this territory. But their units could get cut off here nonetheless. Anyways, I don't know, where this is going to go. It's interesting that on one end you have Ugledar has fallen, and the other end of the whole southern front line, you have the city in Zaporozhye called Kamyanka. So are they trying, are they moving for something? Is it a bluff? Most of the intense fighting is all happening in Donetsk. That's where it's constant. And that's about it. The only other thing is the Russians retook the aggregate plant in Vovchansk. This is crazy. The place is absolute rubble. I mean, it is maybe the worst city I've seen so far destroyed. It was a PR stunt for them, and it was a PR stunt for the Ukrainians. The Russians dropped an enormous fab bomb. They got rid of any Ukrainians that were there. The Russians went in, planted flags. I don't know if they're going to stay, because frankly, there's almost no place to hide. We're talking about an industrial area that's been,
And
it
was
it's
never
almost
a
all in
serious
ruins.
front. It was never a
What's
serious.
that?
It was never a serious front.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
to draw pressure off the other fronts, which, for the time being, seems to have succeeded because there was the incursion there. It calmed down. It picked back up. We've seen this in recent weeks. We saw the Russian display of force. We saw the planting of the flag. So it is likely going to fade to the back of everyone's mind in the near future. Uh, Barring a major offensive towards Kharkov in the event that the Kursk incursion is put to rest, which we'll see what happens over the coming days and weeks with that. But I think we can safely say at this point, for the next few days and weeks, it's not going to be much more than the basic back and forth. The main action you're going to get, of course, is in Donetsk. It is in the Pokrovsk direction, as we've seen happening, which I think has been leading up to this for a long time. And that is where the momentum of the war is going to shift. And we already have the Ukrainians haphazardly, might I add, trying to set up defensive lines behind Pokrovsk, realizing that is the last 2014 line that they had set up. And
Yeah.
what we saw in the lead up to the 2023 counteroffensive, the so-called defensive barriers, the Dragon's Teeth, the trench lines that were supposed to be built in Kharkov, it was a joke. I think we may have gone over the article, we may have breezed over it and referenced it back. I think it was uh, beginning of this year. I think it was March, April of this year, where it was once again a New York Times article going in detail over the local corruption as to why these defensive lines did not get built in Kharkov and what a joke it turned out to be, and how you had
Hmm.
the material for all this just sitting around. So, given the track record of the Ukrainians since the outbreak of the war in terms of building the defensive structures, it I can't say I have much confidence in the Ukrainian government. And to build on that point, actually, what main defensive structures, say from 2014, well, okay, 2014 isn't fair, but from Zelensky onwards, from Zelensky, let's say from 2019 to 2022, before the outbreak of the special military operation, most of those lines were built under Poroshenko. Most of those lines were built under the previous administration. What did Zelensky do in order to prepare for this war that he eventually stumbled his nation into? Is the
Mm.
real question. And I think going forward, and the question of Zelensky's political legitimacy, the question of a successor, that is going to be one of those vital things that get brought up. If the Candy Bar Cabal, to return to them, decides that they want Zaluzhny or Klitschko or somebody else in power in Ukraine, who is more aligned with the Poroshenko vision of the country. And, I mean, if not Poroshenko himself, I know that he hasn't ruled himself out of Ukrainian politics, even at this point. And, look, you can hate the man. I have nothing positive to say about him. But objectively speaking, when we look at the defensive lines that have held in Ukraine since the outbreak of the special military operation, they were all built under the previous administration, and that the guy in power right now, the man who goes around the world constantly begging for money, arms, and support. I'll get into that in just a minute here, his failed peace summit. This is what he has delivered us. Well, not us, but the Ukrainians. This is what he has delivered to his nation. So even the Ukrainians who are hardline about this, they have to be looking at Zelensky. Not that I think they were ever too fond of him in the first place. He was more useful than anything. And have to realize whatever utility he had is quickly disappearing. And you look at his Western sponsors, and I think they're starting to agree.
Yeah, that's incredible news, especially the Ramstein news. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, it's not that I hate to say it. I hate to make a claim that I think we know which way the war is going. Of course, if there's no surprises, but I mean, what else? What would you read from it?
I mean, with the news about the Ramstein summit falling apart, which just to reiterate, Joe Biden has pulled out of the meeting, and Joe Biden and Tony Blinken have pulled out of the meeting at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which was scheduled for October 12th. Now, the official reason that they gave is that
And
they,
Blinken.
yeah, and Blinken. The official
Wow.
reason that they gave is they need to be stateside to deal with the fallout from the hurricanes, which, okay, Biden, fair enough, but even Blinken, really, the
I
Secretary
know.
of State, that's when it starts to raise some eyebrows. And that's also on top of the fact that they announced they would not be attending Zelensky's November Peace Summit, which altogether has been canceled because Switzerland doesn't
It
want to host
has.
it. Nobody wants to host the thing. Nobody wants to touch the thing with a 10-foot pole because it's so untenable. The Ukrainian position, Zelensky's wish list carries no weight. They're tired. Even his most fervent backers are tired of his demands, tired of his fantasies, really. And I think we started to see hints of this in full force, at least, back when the Germans were drafting their yearly budget, and they said, we simply don't have any more money to give to Ukraine. And then we got the lack of authorization for the long range missiles from the U.S. And from the UK for that extent, but once again, it all had to come back to the U.S. because of the GPS and targeting systems tied into both the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS and pretty much every Western missile system that would be available to the Ukrainians. And it's just been slowly but surely more and more news of that sort coming out, turning against Ukraine. Even Macron hasn't outright said anything, but even he is waffling as he does. But there doesn't seem to be a Western leader, barring Mark Rutte, who just came into NATO, so he needs to really prove himself. He needs to talk a
Yeah.
big game. I mean, even to the point where Donald Tusk in Poland isn't enthusiastic about this, and we're talking
Yeah,
a
and
poll a
Zelensky
year.
was at 10 Downing Street today meeting with Starmer.
Yes, and he seemed disinterested as ever, which I imagine he has much bigger concerns at the moment. But even then, he's still. Zelensky's not getting the time of day that he used to. Is the ultimate point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going.
Uh, I,
I don't think it's going to return to that point. And I think that he has blown his political capital. And the easiest way out of this, the most favorable situation Zelensky could hope for, is that they organize some sort of quote unquote elections, even under fire, or if they secure some sort of tentative peace agreement, which I severely doubt. But they might try to organize some sort of, let's be honest, sham election in order to get somebody new in power. In which case, at this point, looking at the field, I think uh, Klitschko is probably one of the more likely options to succeed Zelensky.
well, there was an article that came out this week, just a few days ago, and I don't remember if it was Times Magazine or The Economist, and they were basically saying that Ukraine might have to have a different leader than Zelensky. I also find it interesting that he went to speak to Starmer because remember, after Starmer got elected, he went to America and he didn't meet with Biden; he met with Trump. Um, that tends to make you believe that Starmer at least believes Trump will be the next president. I
And
mean, I wouldn't rule anything out, but it seems very odd that he would go and meet with Trump.
I know Viktor
Like on the one
Orban.
hand, Trump is the danger to democracy. On the other hand, Starmer goes and meets with him. That must have panicked Zelensky.
Oh, absolutely. And I know Viktor Orban is the renegade. He is the one you would expect to meet with Trump, but he kicked off the trend. You had Starmer do it. You had David Lammy, his foreign secretary, who, in the past, even before he was foreign secretary, was, let's just say, had some very harsh things to say about Trump. He was one of the big hysterical voices on the other side of the Atlantic about Trump. All of a sudden, especially after his assassination, trying to be very conciliatory towards Trump. You had Zelensky meet with all three of them, met with Biden, met with Harris, met with Trump. And you're seeing this continue where I think even some of the other leaders from the NATO summit have been in contact with Trump if they haven't outright met with him, where there is a growing acceptance among Western leadership, at least, that Donald Trump is poised to succeed Biden. He is poised to return to the White House, and that they are planning accordingly. And I think one of the biggest pieces of evidence of this is the so-called Trump-proof aid packages to Ukraine that they keep on trying
Yes.
to push forward this aid through 2025 and beyond to the point where Trump couldn't revoke it and he would have to follow through because it would already be official policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think if we want to get too much in the elections, which I don't want to, at least at this moment,
Yeah.
uh, global trends sense that Trump is poised to come into office, and also if you want to tie this back to the Middle East, which we'll get into in a little bit here, I would argue that both Iranian and Israeli actions reflect that they believe Trump is going to come into office in January after he wins in November, and that there's just been a general acceptance that Harris is going to lose. Now, whether she was actually put up to it to be the throwaway candidate, frankly, I think they probably would have. Maybe they didn't have a way out of it. I think they would have chosen a less desirable candidate to throw away because I do think they stake something on Harris's political future, unless they're trying to build up because. Of course, a lot of American politics is narrative driven. They're trying to build up her comeback. She lost the first time, but she's back and swinging, and she's gonna take down whoever the nominee is in 2028. But like I said, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on that. But going back to the initial point here, Zelensky's prospects are extremely grim, and I would imagine at this point, despite all his bloviating about a peace treaty, despite all his bloviating about the fact that negotiations can start at some point in 2025, we expect the war to go on another year, and then we can finally have Russia in the position we want them, where we can close the trap and start the negotiations. Realistically, what I think is happening behind closed doors, what I think he's talking to his inner circle about, is how do we get our golden parachutes? What is our way out? Do we go for a government in exile? Do we work for an NGO? Where are we going to go into exile if we do so? And what's the future of Ukraine going to be? Are we going to write this off as a lost project and I'm going to be the hero who still speaks about Ukrainian freedom while it's under Russian control or a Russian puppet state where Ukraine used to be? Or is there going to be some sort of more comprehensive negotiations where I get to sit in my penthouse in New York or Miami or whatever Western city we might want to pick and people just forget I existed?
Yeah, and the other thing that you're also seeing is, there are like basically two, maybe three factions right now in the West that have been thrown into division over Ukraine and Israel. Um, and it's also crazy. I should mention that the Times of London, during Zelensky's meeting with Starmer, talked about the prospects of the British going into Ukraine to train personnel there. Again, we're hearing the same stuff that we heard about the French doing. Remember in the summer, Macron's almost threats that he would do this. We're seeing that again now. The RADA has passed a law that allows officers and soldiers from non-Ukrainian background to become essentially instant Ukrainian citizens. I believe it was heard in the RADA today, and it was passed. When it will be implemented, I don't know, but I imagine it will be soon.
Which of course
And
makes them
sorry,
eligible for foreign service, for service in the AFU as foreigners because they'll have been issued a Ukrainian passport at that point, and that is the
yes,
main conscription drive. And I want to see if I do have those numbers. I do think I sent them to you of the casualty rates among foreign volunteers in Ukraine. I might need to pull those from somewhere else because they were mind blowing. But do go on.
yeah. So the Financial Times had a headline: Ukraine's shifting war aims. U.S. and Ukraine are ready to discuss ceasefire in Russia temporarily governs the occupied regions of Ukraine. The article notes that the mood in Washington and some Western countries is changing from a determination to end the war only after Russia's army has been driven out of Ukraine to a reluctant admission that the best option that can be hoped for is a negotiated settlement that leaves most of the country intact. So, I mean, this was another idea that was thrown around in the past few days this week about let's turn this into a frozen conflict and put the rest of Ukraine into NATO immediately. I mean, there's no way Putin is going to stop and allow that to happen. So, yeah, I mean, like, I would say there are basically like Starmer's visit in a way shows a kind of interaction through of two or three elite groups within the West. So you have, like, you would call maybe the techno globalists, Obama, Starmer, Blair, even Cameron, like all these people, like that's who they are. Most of the EU is that, right? Um, then you have like the hardcore Zionists in America, right? And Trump is part of that group, right? Starmer is meeting with him. They're discussing, I'm sure, the situation between Ukraine and Israel, because Israel is broadening its war, so it's going to need more and more resources. And if it pulls America into Iran, which is it's a greater likelihood with Trump than it would be with Biden. And now you have stories, for instance, circulating that ISIS has been reactivated and Western cities better watch out. That was a headline today in Britain. I can't recall whether it was the Guardian or the Telegraph. Uh, you know, we're being set up for 2015, 2016 again, right? When the war in Syria was raging, and there were all kinds of attempts to like keep the public engaged with the Middle East and maybe go in because Russia was kind of cleaning house
Well, there's also a Turkish
against.
angle there that I'll get into when we talk about our Middle Eastern news with Turkey's new
Yeah,
announcements.
yeah. So so you have these factions, and the techno guys basically they want Ukraine. They want to win in Ukraine. They want to drive Russia out. They want to foment a regime change in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Right? The Zionists, of course, most of them are in America, don't want this, and of course they're fixated that now should be the time. And Smotrich today in Hebrew was talking on Israeli television about how we're going to increase the size. We're going to go beyond Jordan. We're going to go into Lebanon, Syria, the Sinai. We're going to expand our territory. We need more territory. And the interviewer says, "How are we going to do it?" He goes, "Oh, we'll do it bit by bit." So you can well imagine that some kind of terrorist action, it wouldn't take a lot. It would not need necessarily a 9/11. Remember that they're also stupid. That is, I think, a lot of American elites, and they will, because in a way, 9/11 just keeps doing the work for them. Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, they can never risk pulling off another 9/11, but they might not need to have to do that, right? So if there's some terrorist action and it's linked to Iran magically, then Trump seems like the candidate that could rouse the spirit of like young white American men to go fight and die for Israel against Iran. Um, I see that as a possibility, even though it's obvious that by now that Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran are not really they don't want this war. I think Hamas expected that the war would end sooner, that they would be given some kind of guarantees, but that has not happened. We'll
I
get into
you
the
look
Middle
at
East news, but
you look at their own communications with Netanyahu, the backdoor ceasefire they made in order not to target each other's leadership. The Israelis threw that out the window with the
yes, they did. Yeah.
assassination of Nasrallah. So I do think Hezbollah, whether they thought Israel was not in a position to push it further, or maybe were naive about it, did think that some sort of cooling of tensions, at least, was in the cards. But
Yeah.
that was simply not the case. I do want to return your attention, however, and I did send it to you as well.
Hmm.
These are figures from the ISW, from the Institute of Study of War, which we've read many of their pieces on air.
Yes.
Greatly critical of them, by the way. But these are interesting statistics nonetheless about mercenaries, aka foreign volunteers, who were fighting on the side of Ukraine, who have suffered a serious injury from the 6th of August to the 1st of October as amount of percentage. Now, 6th of August was around the time when the Kursk operation began.
Yep.
And I'll just read this to you, those who are doing audio only, because I know there's a few people out there who listen to this on the go, whatever. Colombians, which we've seen an uptick of Colombian mercenaries in Ukraine in the past several months, 89% suffering some sort of injury or disability. Poles, 88%. Germans, 62%. French, 71%. Americans, 64%. All these are well over half,
Yep.
pushing the 2/3, and it goes greater even in some cases. And we have seen, especially with the Colombians, I know there was some recent case with that, and I have no reason to believe that they would treat any of their foreign mercenaries any differently, is that they were forcing them into the deadliest missions. They were forcing them to the deadliest parts of the front, and more or less sending them in, I don't like the term, but I'll use it for lack of a better term, meat waves against Russian positions. And there has been, I believe, and I think there has to be, if these numbers are true, and ISW, once again, highly politicized. When the other game, they are rabidly pro-Ukraine, but so if they're willing to publish these numbers, there's a narrative behind it, as with pretty much every publisher, but ISW in particular. It does make me wonder what sort of narrative they're trying to weave with this, whether it's time for the mercenaries to get out of Ukraine, whether we should have given them more support. I don't know what angle they really want to take with this, but these, I don't know, these figures do stick out to me, and
It's why would ISW publish this?
exactly. That's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of. Is this them? Because they wouldn't cut Ukraine loose. This is their project. This is their pet project. This might as well be run by Newland, for all we care. And I do think there are
Right.
some actual tangential ties to Newland and her ilk when it comes to the ISW. But is the idea that we're just not supporting them enough? Is that the narrative they're trying to weave,
Mm.
or is this perhaps getting into the question of Zelensky, of the current Ukrainian leadership, that they're clearly not competent enough to handle this war, and this is what they do to their foreign mercenaries? What are they doing to their own frontline troops? And there needs to be a changing of the guard in Ukraine. And when Kursk finally fails, we might be able to link it back to that. Look at Zelensky's stupid idea for the Kursk offensive. This man isn't fit to lead Ukraine, therefore we need a change in leadership if this war is to continue, if Ukraine is to survive. So,
Which is ironic because we know American NATO generals were part of the
oh,
planning.
of course, they had to be. That's anything that happens in Ukraine and Kiev goes through the Pentagon. Maybe it's laundered through London or Brussels or Paris or whatever, but it all goes back to the Pentagon. They're the one calling the shots. They're the one directing this war. If not directly on the ground, then from Washington itself, and sending over orders, which I know that the Russians have picked up strikes on Ukrainian command centers, but part of the problem with Ukrainian command centers is they're all in the West. They're all in Washington, they're all in Brussels, they're all in London, they're all in Paris, they're all in Berlin.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
I guess you'd need some long range missiles to hit those, which would also escalate the conflict drastically. But point being is, Ukraine's army is not fighting for itself. Look, Syrskyi, I know, deserves a lot of criticism, has made a lot of stupid calls, but even as commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, he is still not the guy in charge.
Yeah.
He might not take direct orders, but there is somebody telling Syrskyi what to do. There's somebody telling Zelensky what to do. I don't think we're covering any new ground with this. I don't think any of this is a novel take, but I do think it's important to bring to light once again that this is what's happening. And like I said, I think it's interesting that the ISW is willing to actually take this position and are willing to uh, push this line. So I just,
Y-
as you,
you know, ISW, for as long as we're talking about Newland, her husband Kagan, the other Kagan, her brother-in-law, which along with Applebaum, are part of the staff of ISW. They're the neocons, right? Think Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, those guys from not just the Bush era, but they go back to the Reagan era and even to the Gerald Ford era, right? So the thing, there's sort of like the third faction here, right? They they are Zionists to a degree, but for them, Russia is the real enemy that you want to take care of, not fight necessarily, even though that they were the engineers of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and probably also Libya. um, you can see that they're more fixated on Russia than they are in the Middle East. It's almost like they're saying the Middle East is kind of it's done. You know, either we can't accomplish more, or Israel will just have to suck it up, or Israel doesn't need that much help, or it'll resolve itself, or the Muslims are just not that strong there. Whatever the kind of narrative they build, Russia is the main enemy,
And these are the
right?
people who are desperate to revive the Iran deal because they think it puts a cork in it. They think it just smooths out the situation in the Middle East so they can
Yeah,
focus on the big prize, which is Russia.
right. And you can see that Macron, for instance, this week wanted to have an arms embargo on Israel. This is where, like, the technocrats are in agreement with the neocons. Russia's the enemy. That's who we have to go after. Let's find a solution for Israel in the Middle East now, even if it only lasts for 5 years. Maybe it'll last 10 years. But um, Russia is the main goal. So, I mean, they're even more favorable, like in the way that they think China should be treated, because of course they understand that if you defeat Russia, China will read the tea leaves right away. That's their suspicion, right? That
I
China
think
will then genuflex to the Americans, to the gay, and it'll all be over, right? Problem solved.
I think the easiest way to
Um,
put this is they more or less parrot everything Brzezinski has already said.
yeah, yeah, and the Zionists in America, you can see that they want the war in Ukraine ended, right? Like a lot of Zionist controlled so-called alternative media in America, right? I'm talking about obviously what's his name, the little guy, mm, Ben Shapiro, for instance, right? Um, but also the gay guy who's adopted a child. What's his name?
That
I'm
does
a
that
I'm
doesn't narrow it down.
a He's Jewish.
Yeah,
Remember he I forget
was he
his
the one?
name.
Was he the one who used to be with like Cenk Uygur and all those people? I can't. But once again, that also doesn't
No.
narrow it down. But you're right. It's the what I suppose 8 years ago, 7 years ago, people would have called the alt light. Very uh, these very safe and sanitized quote unquote alternative
Yes.
media figures who will walk along the razor's edge of what's unacceptable, but always pull back on the important issues.
Right. Right. And so, I see these guys wanting to end the war because they want to reinvigorate the struggle in the Middle East, and they want Israel to, in their minds, they think that if Israel soundly defeats everybody in the region, this will be like the last war. It will resolve and bring in a peace that will last decades and decades. And you can see this with Netanyahu basically addressing the Lebanese and saying, yeah, there's an opportunity that doesn't come very often. Could take decades. He's basically suggesting that they throw out Hezbollah and convince their government to I don't to allow the Israelis
Acquiesce to all demands.
to all demands, right? It's not really going to work. Part of the reason they might be under the pretense that this could work, of course, is the Abraham Accords, right? It looked like there was going to be a peaceful way to bring about this new order in the Middle East, right? But that would have the Palestinians would have had to have been sacrificed in order to achieve that. And it would not have included the entire Middle East. Like, of course, Syria, Iran, and for all intents and purposes, Iraq would not be a part of this.
It was
Definitely not in the short and medium term.
it was for the Gulf states.
Yes.
Egypt was already secure. Jordan would fold no matter who put
Oh,
pressure on
Jordan
it.
is just,
it
it's a
it's
total
a
puppet state.
it's a non-entity. And you can't even necessarily blame them because it's barely a country as it is. So Syria and Lebanon would have had to been neutralized by force. Iran would have to either been neutralized or backed into a corner. Iraq is still a mess, but their primary concern would be to drive the Iranians out of Iraq to what degree they still are there. But the Abraham Accords was for the Gulf states and maybe a couple countries in North Africa, think Morocco. But I do think, I'm glad you brought that up. This was one of Trump's last big foreign policy moves in office. And this was 2020. The world was much different in the fall of 2020. The Ukraine war. I know that Biden didn't have much interest in continuing the Abraham Accords, at least to the same way that Trump would have. But the Ukraine war, I do think, threw a massive wrench in this because of the West response of the sanctions regime. That is what spurred on the reconciliation talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I know they were brokered through China, but the change in global conditions caused by the West's response to the Ukraine war spurred on a lot of the talks we saw in the Middle East in late 2022, early 2023, pre October 7th. October 7th, once again, has thrown a wrench in things, but we have seen generally things continue. Saudi Arabia seems to be keeping its feet in both camps, that they want to not antagonize the Israelis too much if it goes their direction, but they also don't want to return to the status quo with the Iranians and be at odds with them because there's a lot of money to be made by partnering with the Iranians. So,
Mhm.
particularly under Mohammed bin Salman, it has been a very delicate balancing act. And I think that also applies for the other Gulf states. UAE might be more pro Israel, for example, and some of the other smaller Gulf states might be more pro Israel because they have less influence to throw around. But because of the Ukraine war, you can say what you will about Biden. I certainly don't have much positive to say, really, in any regard. That is, in my opinion, what really trashed the Abraham Accords. The fact that the Americans showed that if this is going to be the response to any sort of transgression, massive sanctions regime, pretty much all economic warfare, then these countries that are more or less being bribed to be pro-Israel, being bribed to throw the Palestinians under the bus, are going to have less confidence in their American partners that the same thing will not happen to them. Now, I doubt that they had too much confidence in the Americans in 2020, but whatever confidence did exist markedly dropped post February 2022, especially when they started talking about freezing the assets, especially when China also came in and really set itself as a peacemaker, as a broker in the region. And even with the Palestinian issue, the Chinese have tried to become a broker by hosting summits with various Palestinian political factions as well as political factions from other Arab states. So they're also trying to position themselves in the region like that. And October 7th has made the Americans show their hand even more that it's going to be rabidly pro Israel, which I don't think anyone would have doubted. But these Gulf states that maybe saw some utility in partnership with America, and maybe still do to some degree, have lost a great deal of trust and a great deal of confidence that I think would have previously existed uh, had both the Ukraine war not happened and had both the Israeli response to October 7th been different.
I think that you put it very well. Um, yeah, yeah.
But I suppose because the topic has naturally made its way to the Middle East, we should focus on some of the buildup between Iran and Israel now. Unless you want to talk about the situation between Turkey and Syria first, I'm game for either.
Um, I am too. Either one.
I think let's just knock Turkey Syria out of the way because I think it flows more naturally because Turkey is also a country that has been profoundly affected by both of these events when it comes to its relationship with the United States and the West. Turkey, once again, had its conflicts, has had its run-ins with the West, especially being the eastern flank of NATO, and a country willing to delve into hardball negotiations on multiple occasions, as we've seen, where because of the absolutist sanctions regime and because of America backing Israel to the hilt, the Turkish government and Turkish society, frankly, had lost a great deal in confidence in America, in the West, the collective West, as it were, as a result of those two events. In which you see Turkey, they'll be attending the BRICS summit in Kazan in the next couple weeks here. They're on far friendlier terms with Russia than they have been in arguably centuries, if you want to go back that far, if you want to look at the grand totality of relations between the Russians and the Turks as peoples, as nations. Uh, we're talking about some of the best relations in centuries, a historical rivalry that has been, I won't say it's smoothed over or has been laid to the rest, but let's just say has been tempered greatly by a number of factors, but in recent years and the past couple decades here, by frankly American brazenness and their unwillingness to really conduct a proper foreign policy and really to show any degree of restraint. But Turkey, ever eager to play both sides, and perhaps this is also another signal that they expect Trump to come back into power, because you saw this dynamic with Trump, Turkey, and Syria in 2018 and 2019, where the Turks would launch their new operations. First was the Idlib operation. What was that one Kurdish city that they invaded? Was it Manjib or something? That uh, we're talking like I think 2018, back when they had the incursions into the Kurdish territories in northwestern Syria. And with that, we see this trend continue, where they have prepared operations in Syria. Now, what they claim is, and this is what they've been claiming for the past 5, 6 years, is that this operation is targeted particularly towards Kurdish militants. But you have seen the activation of the Turkish proxy groups in northwestern Syria, particularly concentrated around the Idlib area. And there hasn't been outright intense clashes with the Syrian government, but tensions have been rising. And this has been in a period when Syria and Turkey were supposed to be on the path of reconciliation. We did have Russia trying to broker that, and arguably to some success were brokering that, but they have. I'm not going to say they've thrown that out the window, because talks are still in progress, and we will need to see what this operation actually looks like. It could just be a lot of bluster on the part of Turkey, but even despite their rhetoric against Israel, which one could compare words and actions, Turkey, I do think, policy wise and in its actions, is growing markedly more anti Israel than they have been in previous years, because there has been some bluster since the start of October 7th. But it came out, of course, Turkey's trade with Israel is still normal. They're still selling the parts that Israel used to manufacture weapons, etc., etc. There has actually been a decrease in that as well. But I do think that Operation Syria, while not directly related to the issue between Israel and Iran, is definitely them looking at the opportunity, looking at the instability in the region, and looking that Syria might also be back in the crosshairs of the American empire, and now it is time to act. Which, like I said, I do think suggests, because this is the policy that Erdogan pursued under the Trump administration in Syria, that, returning to our previous conversation, he may also be anticipating Trump returning into office, where he can play these games, where he can have these incursions into Syria, where he can activate his proxies or even send in his regular forces to feud with these Kurdish militias, and then not have Turkish troops evacuate from that land in some sort of bargaining with the U.S., because they are serving a role of putting pressure on Syria, the Syrian government, while also accomplishing their own ends, while also having some bargaining chip with the Russians, because they can use that as a vector for cooperation with the Russian forces still
Yeah.
in Syria. So this could just be regular Turkish posturing, but I think it's Turkish posturing towards the trends in the region, and also the expectation of the political shifts that will be happening in Washington within the next few months.
Yes, I think you described the situation in Syria exactly how it is. There was some hope, as far as early as August, which wasn't too long ago, that Erdogan was ready to meet um, with Assad and resolve some of the issues, but you can never trust Erdogan. Um, And then you have strange stuff like Russia is doing military exercises with Azerbaijan now. I tend to look at this as a reaction of Armenia moving closer to NATO and opening up a NATO office in Armenia. Now, I know there was a CIS meeting in um, what's his name? Pashinyan, arrived there. He went to the meeting on a bicycle.
Oh, that video. Yes, surrounded by his security, all on bicycles, just him riding through
It
Moscow,
was
filming this video, trying to. It's like I'm a normal guy out on my bike tour, and there's just a security there. But I'm glad you brought that up with the CIS summit, which is uh, an organization of most of the Soviet successor states, excluding, of course, the Baltic states and also Ukraine as well. I think Moldova is still also part of it. But also on that same point, Pashinyan will also be attending the BRICS summit in Kazan later in the month as well.
right, right. Um, he has seen Western politicians do this to create this illusion of being an everyman. Just a regular guy, and so he decided to do it himself. Look at me, I'm a regular guy from this little country called Armenia. In a way, he is also trying to demonstrate how he's not like Putin. There's no huge entourage, bodyguards everywhere, streaming up and down that central highway in Moscow, going around the rings and whatnot. He's trying to distance himself from Putin in every respect, and,
From
and
that
of course,
Oriental despotism. Oh boy.
yes, yes, and so he I mean, that's the way I read that, and yeah. So now, Israel this week did attack Syria several times, Damascus included, at least a dozen dead, three different apparent ammo depots, and the coordinator for armaments for the Iranian military that is in Syria was apparently taken out.
I'll actually, while we're talking about that, put up the most recent South Front report on Syria. They did publish their map right here. But I do have to say, a lot of what happened in the past week and a half in Syria felt very reminiscent of 2018, 2019. And you could have taken a
Hmm.
number of these stories, Israeli strikes, Turkish action, whatever, and it would have felt like we were doing a show back in 2019 just with better quality. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And of course, it was a hit on Latakia, but it's uncertain who attacked it. Now, some have said Israel, some have said that is Tahrir al-Sham. No one was injured, fortunately. It was a drone, from what I read. Uh, that could change. Maybe it's old news, but um, that was a cause for concern because you know the Israelis have been mostly focusing around the south, Damascus, Hama, Homs, around those areas. Of course, they are afraid of troops and volunteers basically going to fight in southern Lebanon against the Israelis, right? A lot of people will stream into there um, to fight the Israelis in Lebanon. Uh, and I guess, the Israelis have already moved. There are several incursions into southern Lebanon at the moment. Um, the way it began was not great. They lost 20 men on the first day and another four on the day after. So they're experiencing the kind of losses in southern Lebanon the way they did in Gaza. Remember that up until this incursion, very few casualties for the Israelis up there. After 9 months, about 100 dead in the northern part, but in the southern part, about 600, 650. Um, I mean, you have to ask yourself, what is Netanyahu doing? Um, the amount of resources that are going to be necessary for Israel to, let's say, um, conquer more land outside of just the Gaza Strip, which is 10 kilometers by 2 or 3 kilometers wide. That I mean, Lebanon is not big, a big country by any means. It's about the size of Israel, but nonetheless, they are expanding, and They're not just bombing Lebanon; they're bombing Syria, as I just said.
And that's also on top of the speculated strikes that are going to come against Iran, which I'll get into in just a moment. But because you brought it up, the beginning of the IDF operations in southern Lebanon, I just put up a topographical map just to give you an idea of what the IDF is getting itself into with some of the casualty reports. And you can see the borders right here. You can see to the south Israel with the Golan Heights annexed. You can see Lebanon up north. And I put a rough scale. This is from a global topographical map website. This is just a screen capture from it of what the heights look like and the incursions in the southern Lebanon. Now, very south Lebanon, no, it's not that much of a drastic difference in elevation, but you start to get towards the Syrian border, you start to get towards those parts. And depending on how extensive an operation Israel decides to dedicate to Lebanon, this could be a very brutal conflict for them. And unlike the Lebanese Civil War, unlike the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, whatever base, whatever allies of convenience they had back then, no longer trust them because you can talk about the Maronite militias, you can talk about all these groups that aligned themselves with Israel. Well, look at the course of the Lebanese Civil War. It was Israel stabbing them in the back. It was selling out their people. It was selling out their leaders when they got too powerful, when they got too inconvenient. So, while these people, they might hate Hezbollah with every fiber of their being, they're not going to trust Israel, and they're not going to do Israel's dirty work for them, regardless of whatever they feel about the ethnic and religious conflicts within their own country. They've been burned by Israel once, and I don't think they're eager to get burned by Israel again because it's still within living memory.
Yeah, it reminds me of that. I think it was on Twitter, and it might have been one of the idiots in the Israeli government, or it might have been just one of their journos who wrote something like, "Christians wake up. Without Israel, Christianity could be doomed." Like it's more of this like completely ridiculous ass backwards idea about how Israel is protecting the West. And you know, Netanyahu today berated Macron for suggesting an arms embargo, because of course it's not just the states that are giving arms to Israel, it's also Britain. You know, the irony that Netanyahu cannot step foot in Britain because he'll be arrested, but at the same time he'll get arms from Britain.
Oh, and I'm glad he brought up the ICC because it's made a complete joke of itself with its warrants towards Putin and its warrants towards Netanyahu, regardless of what you think of either of those. We've seen, number one, they won't arrest Putin. Number two, Britain is supposed to be 100% behind Israel, and as you said, he can't show up without potentially being arrested by the British. And what's going to change as a result of that? Nothing. Nothing's going to change as a result of that, and they're going to continue this policy. And Israel is just going to keep on pushing its limits further and further. And until what? Until what happens? And are they going to con the Americans and the Europeans and the collective West into participating in their cataclysmic regional war? Are they going to con them into a war with Iran? Third time's the charm. Look, you took out Afghanistan, you took out Iraq, you've been meddling in the region, you tried to overthrow Assad in Syria, we had the Arab Spring. None of those particularly succeeded, but if we just take out the Iranians, they are the root of all evil in the region. They are the source of chaos. And you listen to Netanyahu's speeches for years. This has been the narrative he's been trying to weave. And that if we just participate in this one last operation, we'll have a lasting peace in the Middle East with Israeli hegemony. And Israel won't have to resort to the extreme methods that it is. And Hamas will up and disappear and fall into the sea. And then we can have a lopsided deal with the Palestinians where they get their rump state that's more or less governed completely by Israel, and it's all going to be perfect because Israel has achieved its goals. We're going to bulldoze the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we're going to build the Third Temple, and we're going to have our Messiah. That's what a lot of these people think. That is, and I'm not exaggerating here, that is what a non-insignificant amount of people, both inside and outside of Israel, think is going to be the result if they continue down this doomed policy. And I don't really know what you can even say to those people who are bought so far into this that they think this is going to be the result. I mean, listen, okay, Lindsey Graham is probably more of a cynic or somebody who is being blackmailed based on his behavior. But listen to his rhetoric, listen to the people that support him. One clip that comes to mind constantly that I don't think gets enough play, and for copyright reasons, I don't want to take that risk, especially with how touchy some of the platforms have been lately. You'll recall back during the Iran deal when it was in negotiations, Mike Huckabee saying that Barack Obama was opening the doors to the oven. Almost exact words. I'm not sure. I might be flipping
Mm-hmm.
words around, but in effect, those were his words that Barack Obama was opening the doors to the ovens all over again by agreeing to the Iran deal. So this is the level of just blind dedication they have to this issue. And I don't think that's going to change. And I know that you've had upswells of pro Palestinian, or maybe not even necessarily pro Palestinian, but anti Israeli sentiments within large segments of American society. But in terms of the halls of power, we talked about this last week. There's no significant anti Israel rhetoric from the Democrats. Even the ones who have been the most critical of Israel have softened their tone, and that on Capitol Hill, it's just simply not a topic that gets addressed within the State Department. It's not a topic that gets addressed. The Pentagon might be annoyed with them, but they'll reluctantly go along with the orders that they're given because what else are they going to do? And even the people are who we were discussing earlier, who want to buy Israel 5 to 10 years so we can take care of the bigger issues, we can take care of Russia, we can maybe even take care of China, and then we'll revisit the Middle East in 5 to 10 years time. Even those people are very few and far between these days. And the only way you get any position of power, whether openly or behind closed doors in the United States, does seem to be if you endorse some degree of the most radical Israeli plans. And I don't think that's going to change. I think really the only way that does change is if Israel suffers a humiliating defeat, maybe at the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or whether the operation in Gaza completely falls in on its face, or there is a wider escalation and they have a clash with maybe Iranian forces, maybe the IRGC in some third theater that is neither Iran nor Israel. But point being is, I think the only way this conflict ends is either Israel pushes for its maximalist goals and wreaks havoc across the region, or they suffer an embarrassing defeat that maybe doesn't destroy the country, maybe doesn't even come close to collapsing the country. Maybe, well, okay, maybe I doubt Netanyahu would stay in power. Maybe even Likud stays in power, but they suffer a defeat that they simply cannot recover reputationally from in the near future, and are forced to walk away with their tail in between their legs and accept some sort of humiliating peace that they would have never accepted on October 8th or any of the following days since the Hamas attacks back in 2023. But point being is, this ends one of two ways. And even if Israel suffers a humiliating defeat but still lives to see another day, there is going to always be factions in Israel, especially as long as they have nuclear weapons, who are going to push this radical policy, who are not going to look at the situation pragmatically and think that maybe it's time we try to have some inroads with our neighbors. Maybe it's time we try to act like any other state would of our size that just can't constantly antagonize every other country in the region without building a coalition war against it. Who knows? But I do want to return to the point about Syria because we did bring that up. And I'm not necessarily saying this would happen, but I am saying I do think it is an aim for some people for it to happen. While, at least seemingly, global Muslim rage is focused on Israel. Now, it's been a rather impotent rage, I will admit, compared to some of the other global Muslim rages that we've seen in the past 20 years. That not much has really been done on a global front by the Islamic countries of the world and by the Islamic diaspora of the world. And of course, I'm not advocating for any illegal action. I don't want to see anything else escalate. But what better scenario would there be for Israel than for another swelling up of jihadist sentiments against the Assad government, against Shia Muslims, against whoever the internal Islamic rival of the week is? And I do think, I'm not saying that is a guarantee, I'm not even saying it's likely, but I do think it's a distinct possibility that some strings can be pulled, some games can be played that once again spark another major Muslim internal conflict while Israel is on the brink, really. And uh, especially with the actions in Syria, I wouldn't say this if it wasn't for the recent week and a half in Syria. that there might be some sort of play. And I know that you said they're fear mongering about the reactivation of ISIS. And funny enough, while they might say like, oh, they're building their cells around Western cities, where ISIS is probably actually being reactivated right now is in Eastern Syria. And we've seen this slowly but surely over the past couple years. But I do think that they are really going for build up where there's a significant amount of people who want to reignite the Syrian civil war to whatever degree they can.
Yeah. Yeah, because they also look at it as a way to potentially end the war in Ukraine's favor, and probably also help Israel in its war efforts. It would do that. It would do that. But are the resources there? Do the Saudis, or I should say, do the Qataris want this that badly, and the Americans? Because of course that's who's funding them in one way or another. Um, of course, America has a very long history of funding radical Islamic factions that then turn on them, but then they work with them again. Al Qaeda is a prime example. Um, but a lot of the threats they're suggesting are for those in Europe. Now, like, of course, it was nonsensical. What was the narrative that was being built in 2014, 15, and 16 when we had all those massive I mean, migration is still going on. It's decreased a little bit, but it's still going on. Um, you know, the narrative was so lazy. On the one hand, like the people who were committing the attacks were not on Assad's side in Syria, far from it. These were, extremist Sunni Muslims that of course, hate Shias and other, Shia denominations, if you will, um, like the kind that Assad belongs to. And but the narrative was so jumbled, it was so confusing. Um, we should be in Syria because they're attacking us in France, Germany, Sweden, and Britain. But these are terrorists that got their asses handed to them in Syria that you funded.
Yes, in fact, your entire purpose in Syria is to protect those guys from Assad's government and his allies.
Right, without them encroaching against Kurds. Like it is the most, it still is, I think, the most convoluted war in decades. Like you pointed out with Erdogan, right? He gets to go in. His actions against the Kurds can only be limited because, of course, they're crucial for Israel, for Israeli and American interests. But at the same time, the Americans have to um, wave him in, as it were, or look the other way, because he's going to occupy more Syrian territory, and that gives him leverage against Assad. So they're always debating on like what's more important, ousting Assad or I don't know, empowering the Turks. There's no solution. There would have to be such a concerted effort to reignite the Syrian war. I'm not saying it hasn't gone a little bit hot again. It has, but you see much less action than we saw even 2 years ago of ISIS cells ambushing ambushing Syrian soldiers. Remember, 6 dead, a dozen dead. Every once in a while we would,
And
and
particularly
it just kept
officers,
going
they were
on.
attacking the command structure.
Yes, yes. Now you don't hear that, and I haven't heard it in a year at least. So it's reduced quite a bit. And I'm just saying, and of course, some of the funding that Al Sham received from Turkey has been pulled back. Of course, Turkey is asked to sit in and eventually join BRICS.
And in recent years, Qatar and Iran have also had their own reconciliation, which has made
Yeah,
them much less willing to fund any sort of factions within Syria. Now, the problem was with the Gulf states is even if state policy does dictate that they are renewing relations with Syria, that they are pulling back support from these groups, there are a lot of private investors from these Gulf states who are instrumental
Yes.
in funding a lot of the initial militant groups, and even ISIS. Back when ISIS first started, or really first started coming to prominence, a lot of those funds came from private wealthy individuals within the Gulf states. Now,
Yeah.
I imagine they had some sort of connections in Washington, in London, in Paris, Brussels, etc. But point being is, it was of their own volition. In fact, sometimes going against the interest of their government, of their state, in order to take those actions.
Right. Right. And I just don't see that same kind of investment that we saw happening. No matter how little Russia's efforts are in Syria, it's enough to stabilize the situation where really the biggest threat are not Islamists, but Israeli Jews. That's the real threat
Oh, absolutely. And
to Syria.
with most of the skirmishes in Syria in about the past, I don't know, say 3 years, have been between Israeli forces and Iranian-backed forces, not even the Syrian army proper. So that's also another dynamic you need to consider within the Syrian civil war, is that if you had these groups who were managed to coalesce against Assad and his Iranian allies and his other allies within Syria, they would explicitly be fighting on the same side as Israel at that point. Now, I know that's always been the case. They've always been fighting on the same side as Israel as far as the Syrian civil war is concerned. But it was much less deliberate. When you'd have the occasional airstrike into Syria from Israel, that just so happened to benefit whatever militant group was receiving the U.S. funds that day, it's a bit more deniable. But if something like this were to happen now, it would be much harder to deny that you had a bunch of Muslim groups collaborating more or less with Israel openly
Yeah.
in
I mean,
order
you
to
see
fight
those
against Assad's
videos.
government.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. You see those videos where residents living in Idlib, these are total fanatics, right? These people literally believe Syria has to be cleansed of Alawites and Shias and Christians, of course. Not Druze as well in southern Syria, but these people celebrate when Israel attacks Syria. Like that's how myopic they are. They're laser. There are people without a means who are laser focused on a very specific kind of victorious outcome for themselves, and they themselves have no agency. Um, Not really, right? And it's kind of like they're betting with fate, like, oh, if Israel does this, if Israel does that, as if Israel would spare them, you know, as if it's very similar to the way the Ukrainians completely miscalculate the Westerners and the Americans in particular, right? Like even if they ever were victorious, like um as if the gay would treat them differently,
No, of course
right?
not.
Like
And
you see this kind of pressure that's exerted on countries on a cultural level in Poland, for instance, right? No matter how great a help Poland can be to to the gay is not going to give up, and the gay is more than just America. Of course, it's also Brussels. Um, in order to fundamentally change Poland in a way that they have fundamentally changed America, France, Germany, and Britain forever for good.
and that goes back. It applies multiple levels. First off, they need a ritual humiliation. They need to follow the state religion. They need to be loyal vassals. And
Yeah,
also, while Poland might not be that shiny of an example of a country to aspire to. I mean, I'm sure it's a good country in its own right. I have nothing against Poland as a nation. State policy, different question, but I digress. With another European Christian nation, they don't like the example of a country even let's just say, showing deference towards that. Not even necessarily promoting it, but just allowing it or being, passively supporting of it. Which, another reason they despise Hungary as well. Because although Poland, there's a great gulf of cultural similarity between Poland and Western Europe, and of course the Anglosphere, it still is a recognizably European Christian nation. And people in your country might look at that and they might start to get some ideas. Think about all the praise of Poland that went around over the past 8 years or so. Where, like I said, while it doesn't tell the full story, at least it is ostensibly a somewhat right wing Christian European society, and they don't like that. They don't like the image that gives off and the ideas it might inspire in others. So that's one of the other reasons it has to go. And like I said, also on top of making sure that they are fully submissive to the empire, which is why Hungary in particular um, gains their ire to the point where Orban has to dodge an assault at the EU, as I'm sure all of you have seen that video from the past few days there. But returning to the point about the Middle East, about Syria, you do have, and I'm glad you brought up the population of Idlib who are fanatics about this, where they do generally believe that Damascus has to fall before they can retake Jerusalem and expel the Zionists, and that is part of their prophecy that they've cooked up for themselves. But I hesitate to make this comparison, but I think it's the best comparison I can make. Because it is a movie depicting a historical event, so it's going to have some inaccuracy, it's going to have some gross simplification, it's going to have some misrepresentation. But I do think it exemplifies a lot of the problems we've seen in the Arab world in the past 100 years. And I do have to reference the film adaptation of Lawrence of Arabia, where one of the beginning scenes, it's a long movie. I would recommend it. It's a good movie. I like it. Long movie, though. But in one of the opening scenes, first half an hour, where you have Lawrence who goes to Bedouin country and goes to be among the tribes, the contact he meets there is shot by another Bedouin for drinking out of his well. So once again, a very tribal people who do hold these kind of grudges, who can very easily be talked into taking up arms against each other and continuing these centuries-long blood feuds. Like I said, I know it's a very gross simplification example. It's from a movie, but I do think it does touch on a greater point of something that affected these Arabs 100 years ago and affects them today, where they are very easy to pit against each other.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it reminds me of the Europeans, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Um, the way every European kingdom after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, sought to unify Europe in a way that they had known for honestly for at least 400 years, or let's say 300 years, because really, in the first century AD, yes, Rome was quite large, but it expanded significantly after that too. Um, but in any case, let's say 300-400 years, and Charlemagne was an example, and so and of course in the Muslim world they had the caliphates, right? They which controlled huge swaths of territory, and you can see how the nationalist movements destroyed that possibility. Um, and so you have this, you have a religion that unifies these people, and often it's not even the dichotomy between Shia and Sunni that causes them to war with one another, or at least not be the kind of ally that they could be.
Yes, and as in many cases, to further your point, ethnicity and religion do get conflated. Now, they are not the same thing, and there are very clear distinctions, but in many cases throughout history, as we've seen, they do get conflated, in which case those conflicts can grow into one another. But I'm glad you brought up that point as well, because I do think it gets to what I'm trying to get at, where these people can very easily be pitted against one another, and any sort of coalition building can uh, become undone as quickly as it was
Mhm.
created.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, you could argue that, except for a few outliers, a lot of the Muslim world is exhausted, right? Um, partly exhausted by the incessant influence of Western civilization, um, and it has ground it down. I mean, of course, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, like whatever you might say about them, they're still willing to fight. I mean, they're fighting them. Nobody else is. They're the only ones fighting them directly. On some level, you have to respect that.
Yes, I agree, but you do also have to wonder how much of it is just that they have been backed into a corner and resistance is their last option. Which, like, I don't think it necessarily takes away from what you said, but I do think it's worth
Right,
considering.
but the Egyptians gave up.
Yes, the Egyptians did sell out.
There's
The Jordanians folded like they always do. So yes, I like I said, I overall agree, and I think you bring up a good point with that. And it does beg a question about, I guess, as Spangler would put it, Magian civilization, and how much gas is left in their tank, really, and uh, what
uh,
what can we look at with them, especially in their wider conflict with the West and with Israel in particular, and are they up to the task, as it were? Are they able to do this? And I do think there's a real case to be made that they are spent, they are exhausted. I'm not going to wholeheartedly endorse that. I'm not going to say it's finished for them, but I do think there's a reasonable case to be made there. However, once again, one of the things I always go back to is the fact of Israel's propensity to push its luck and to spurn what little help it has and to get itself into situations where it needs bailed out. Now, every time that's happened, they've had someone to bail them out. But even if we were to assume the unwavering support the United States has for Israel remains in spirit, in terms of practical application, in terms of the ability to actually enforce that vision, that's rapidly declining within the United States, especially if we're going to make uh, the empire pick and choose what its priorities are, especially if they choose Russia and or China as a larger priority. As we once again to return to the conversation we were having earlier, Israel could find itself in a situation where it does need bailed out, and there's nobody to do it. I don't think that's likely, but once again, it is one of those things that
yeah,
is in the
nobody.
realm of possibility.
Yeah, I mean, the only like because the comfortable situation that Israel has with America is like, for instance, if there was no America and Israel asked somebody to bail them out, Israel would have to pay for it, but Israel can't pay for it.
No, no, they can't. And
And how much would rural Jewry pay, like to bail them out?
and
Right, like
look at
they
the
have they have a sweetheart deal with the Americans that is just unbeatable. This is why they will never move like to another country. This idea that they're just going to dry up America, like that might happen anyways, but it isn't necessarily because they're doing it. Um, no, they need like Israel can't survive without America. It's a fake state. Like, what was it like 3 weeks after they went to war with Hamas and Gaza? They asked for 8.7 or 8.9 billion dollars and got it. Like, who needs that? Like, and send us 100,000 bombs. Like, wait a minute.
they
Like,
diverted aid away from Ukraine during the counteroffensive to meet
that's right.
Israeli demands.
That's right. That's right. And so, like, no, it and a lot of people, I don't know. I mean, I was telling you off air about my friend who was. There's a meme going around. It's an AI generated illustration of Kamala Harris and Trump both on their knees, genuflexing, as it were, Netanyahu, who seems to have just walked into the room. And a guy um, posts, we have to be very careful about these kinds of narratives because they're such a distorted picture. America is in charge, not Israel, right? And what's funny for me is like both leftoids and rightoids from the West like are very adamant about this. And I told my friend what I told you. I said, you know what? You should just write to them like, So what if Jews control America? What's wrong with that? Why is that a bad thing? We had white Anglo men controlling America. You're for women controlling America. So what if Jews exert so what if Israel controls America? What's the big deal? Because that would be perfection, right? If you responded that way, it would like, because of course the whole premise is, right, they don't want to be too hard on the Israelis, right? Because there's a whole question: are they white or not? Um, America can stop it. I get it. America manufactures the stuff that Israel doesn't. Everybody, yes, I know Israel, the entity, um, and its geographic location cannot exist without America, right? But that distorts. Um, it distorts the picture of who is actually sovereign, right? And the sovereign is always the one that doesn't have to obey the law, and Israel does not have to obey the law, right? America itself has to tread more carefully. It has to make up ridiculous stories, America does, to enter a war, in order not to look like it's breaking the law, right? But Israel is that one country that is allowed to get away with everything. Well, I'm sorry, that's the sovereign. It's not the sovereign that you might picture him with his country, but you know, in a way, it's more sovereign. It gets other people to pay for its existence. It gets tribute. So yeah. So why shouldn't Israel control America?
I'm glad you brought that up. But with that point out of the way, I suppose we should talk about the big story of the Middle East, which is
Yep.
the potential Israeli response. Now, it
Yes.
has gone from all over. We did touch on this a little last week. The considerations are either hitting Iranian oil capabilities or the Iranian nuclear plants. Now, you've had Biden trying to steer them away from this, desperately trying to keep things stable before the election. You had Trump say, "Do it." Well, what are you waiting for? This is under my administration, Israel will be able to do whatever it wants. Is his big sales pitch on that. Um, and then Harris is notably absent as always, nowhere to be found, nowhere to give a public statement, and it's been some hesitation for the Israeli response, and a lot of people, and maybe they had some point for the time being, we're wondering, well, where's the Iranian response? Why does Iran keep talking up this response and never delivering anything? Why does Iran keep acting like it's going to?
I mean, Iran responded,
Yeah, they did respond, and
and this confirmation. You know, remember the last show? I'm sorry to cut you off, but I said at least 2 dozen landings, right? Satellite imagery, British newspapers, American newspapers, they published them. It shows that they hit these centers. They just barely missed Mossad. Like, the Israelis can go on and say nobody was hurt, nothing happened. Nobody believes them. And if it was such a failure, Israel wouldn't be contorting itself trying to figure out how to retaliate. Like, I'm not saying they can't retaliate and that they won't retaliate, or that it may even be spectacular how they retaliate. But like, you can't have it both ways. Like, if it was nothing, then you're acting like it wasn't nothing.
yes, I'm glad you brought that up because you got to my the ultimate point I was going to make there. That it is they do have to pick a narrative, and even Israel, they can't keep up this constant back and forth contradiction. They do have to pick a narrative that these Iranian strikes, yes, while you can talk about the casualties, which I do think that they are probably covering up, they're probably keeping under wraps. You look at the asset damage. Now, I don't believe the maximalist claims that they hit a bunch of F-35s, but I can believe that they may have hit a few, that they hit Israeli air bases, that they did hit vital strategic sites in Israel, and they showed that they were capable of landing those targets, of getting past air defenses. And what does Israel have to respond with? Because we do see them, they are outraged, they want a response, they want it now. They keep kicking the can down the road, they're promised any day now a response is coming. But looking at the options, I mean, if we go back and look at the meeting between Iranian officials and Shoigu, or Iranian officials and Russian officials in general, you can almost be certain that those were talks about particularly air and missile defense systems being transferred from Russia to Iran. And the question is, number one, are those online? Number two, how effective would they be? Number three, how good is it pre-existing Iranian missile and air defense programs? And question four is, how do they stack up against a potential Israeli response? Now, it does look like an Israeli response would have to be carried out with aircraft, probably F 35s, which would have to cut a path over Jordan and Iraq, or take the northern route, go over Lebanon, Syria, possibly crossing the Turkish airspace, if not still within Iraqi airspace, into Iran, or at least in range of Iran, fire at the targets, and then make its way back. I think the math there is about, if we're talking just straight line, if they do the through Jordan and Iraqi airspace, that's about 3,000 mile round trip for it to. Yeah, 3,000 mile round trip is what we'd be looking at with that over open and contested airspace. We don't know the range of, say, Iranian anti-air capabilities. Now, Iran's Air Force proper is outdated. They're still on American F-14s, and their updated air fleet probably isn't going to be a thing for a number of years.
Yeah, I mean they're not going to go toe to toe with the Israeli Air Force, right? Hello?
No, they're not. They're not going to.
I mean it's all about defense right now.
And it, it's going to be a strange war if it does boil over to that point, because they don't border each other. They both have proxies throughout the region. Maybe Iran has more proxies in number, but Israel certainly has its assets throughout the region. And that's excluding getting America involved. Where it's really hard to compare the two pound for pound, as it were, like how you would with Russia and Ukraine, or how you would with Russia and NATO in general, because there's at least something of a shared border, some sort of way a conventional conflict would take place. Whereas this conflict is going to be highly unconventional, and it is going to rely on a lot of hit and run attacks. It is going to rely on a lot of skirmishes in places like Lebanon and places like Gaza, maybe even arguably places like Syria. Uh, and that, like I said, that's assuming that this does escalate to the point of full scale war. There's not really going to be like a front line that shifts and changes, like I said, you see in Ukraine. It's going to be much more war like Syria, just throughout
Yeah.
the region. And they've been pushing for this for years. So I imagine they have all the designs drawn up. We would see what that looks like when push comes to shove. But I do think that it's one of those things that is bound to happen, that Netanyahu is very much pushing for, and that if he does remain in power, is something that will happen. And given any potential success to Netanyahu, it doesn't look like there's many people in Israeli politics who have that much of a different vision. It does look like that the labor Zionists, that the more quote unquote liberal factions within Israel have been sidelined or have been brought into the fold when it comes to supporting this war. Because you get rid of Netanyahu, you still have Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are even more radical about these positions, and who knows what they would do given access to Israel's nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean they might push it, as we said. I think America would probably tolerate Israel dropping a nuke. Um, I mean, I just don't think that Israel is going to be able to decimate Iran the way it has Gaza, and the way it's doing to, let's say, Lebanon, including the capital Beirut. So there is a meeting tomorrow. Putin is meeting with Pezeshkian in Turkmenistan tomorrow. I would imagine that this is, I don't know if this is an emergency meeting or it was scheduled, but it would make sense because we saw Shoigu and um, the prime minister of Russia going to Iran in the last few weeks. So, I mean, they are expecting an Israeli response. Um, but I mean, what does Iran really have? Like, I mean, Iran is buying time. I think that is why it didn't release another barrage of missiles, which really would have shaken the region. It does want an out. On the other hand, Israel also is playing with time, although in a different way, because they're now in a war, probably the longest war of their lives. All the other wars, lasted for a few days or a few months, and that. Um, so now the question of sustainability for Israel comes into play. Of course, for the Americans, they would love to have Iran, new BRICS member, destroyed with the new regime that would probably pull them out of BRICS. So they would like that to happen, but they would probably like that to happen in a different way. I mean,
Yes.
given the fact that Iran is such a huge exporter of oil, of course, if you go after Iranian oil fields and refineries, Iran might do something about the Straits of Hormuz. So it's a tit for tat.
Yes, and while I would say, however, the Strait of Hormuz with Saudi Arabia, there would probably have to be a breakdown in relations with Saudi Arabia before they touch the strait. But there are definitely retaliatory actions they could take throughout the region when it comes to energy prices, when it comes to oil prices, and once again, the biggest losers in that, even though they're not getting much of the Iranian oil anyway, any of the Iranian and Iranian gas for that matter, are the Europeans cut off from two potential energy sources at that point. Of course,
Yeah.
China would also suffer for it. China is a major importer
Yes,
of energy
exactly.
from the Middle East, which case they would probably do everything within their power to keep the straits open, even in the event of a conflict, even if they were explicitly supporting the Iranians, because it's just that, and it's the pipelines from Russia that keep China fueled. Um, but I do think, and this is a radical departure from the current conversation topic, but I think it is necessary to bring up. Should we talk about the new Iranian Shah that was crowned in Washington?
Oh God, yeah, why not?
So, the geniuses in Washington have decided in order to restore democracy within Iran, they must return to monarchy. And let me get this guy's exact name because it's what you'd expect. But the push is to restore the Iranian crown, and that is the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. For any Persian speakers
Hmm.
out there, I apologize if I mispronounced that. And he, of course, is descended from the Shah and his family who were expelled from Iran after the revolution. And he says that the mullahs have created chaos in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon while trying to overthrow rulers in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and that he would oversee the peaceful transition to democracy and the recognition of the State of Israel. Now, I added that last part that is a little bit of editorial work on my part, but I think it's more or less what you could
Yeah.
say. But this is the new regime change option, and I guess this is to play to maybe the diaspora who many left in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, and many of whom have little to no sympathy with the current Iranian government. But once again, it becomes a hard question. Like I said, I don't believe for a second this guy is genuine. I think we all know what the score is here. Where even if you are trying to appeal to dissidents, both in the diaspora and at home, the case doesn't work when your position is we want to eviscerate the country of Iran, we want to have it completely subjugated. Where, like I said, there's people who have discontents with the Islamic Republic for many reasons. Some of them more valid than others, I would imagine. But you don't build up a support base of dissidents by threatening total war against a country. Well, Israel hasn't used those exact words. That is, in effect, what they have done, though. You don't build up a base of support by saying, we want to wipe you off the map. And this goes back to Netanyahu's comments about how the people of Lebanon need to rise up, how the people of Syria need to rise up. And he even was doing this all the way back in the Iraq War, saying that if you take out Iraq, then it will lead to revolutions across the region. It will be a domino effect, showing that the Arab peoples can overthrow their dictators and live in, wonderful democratic regimes that are all very friendly to Israel, of course. And it's the same rhetoric, but that rhetoric does not work when you pair it with uh, just an intention to outright destroy the country. And you see the same thing returning to the Russia conflict, where Russia needs to be broken, Russia needs to be balkanized, but we need brave liberal Russians to stand in the street and support Navalny and overthrow Putin. They want to maintain both these narratives at the same time. They want to appeal to the dissidents in the diaspora who are against the regime, while also writing off the entire ethnicity as evil and irredeemable. And you've noticed this especially with the Russians, where while they did weep their crocodile tears over Navalny, most of the rhetoric about Russia since the outbreak of the SMO in February 2022 has been an indictment of all ethnic Russians. Even if you're one of the quote-unquote good ones, we don't want you. You're still tainted by blood, etc., etc. And they haven't gone quite that far with Middle Eastern countries because of internal political concerns and fears of stoking any sort of racial tensions in the United States and in the Western world. But you do see that rhetoric from Israel, where it is, you must be wiped off the face of the map, your country has no right to exist, but also rise up for freedom and democracy. And this is probably just one of the more disgusting examples of it, this guy who wants to claim some crown that, look, even when the Shah was in power, it was a shell of its former self. He was not the crowning achievement of Iranian glory. And there's a lot you could say about the Iranian government from 53 to 79. It wasn't all terrible. There were certainly reasons for the revolution. But you even look at the political structure. The Shah played very little political role, to my understanding. It was a lot of people under him. I mean, even the initial 1953 coup was under a military officer with the Shah as just simply the face of the country. So it's just ridiculous, and I do think it shows the level that they're at, that they want to revive this whole regime change push into Iran, and that they want to have the Iranian people rise up against themselves, because if not, we would actually have to fight a war against the Iranians, in which case that would be a very costly endeavor that we're not looking forward to. Seems to be the calculus out of Washington, at least.
Yeah.
And I also don't believe that this is a serious regime change ever in any sense of the word. I do think this is the NGOs, think tanks, and lobbies putting up their guy. But I do think
Yeah.
there is a push for some sort of softer regime change in Iran. Certainly, this is just one of the more ridiculous faces of it. But I do think it gets at a greater point where they, although it is ceremonialism, although it is ridiculous, they don't want a more aggressive confrontation with the Iranians, and they would prefer it to be solved by a much more ridiculous and maybe even a pipe dream, if some want to say.
Yeah, they want like a special way this happens. It's kind of like the way we talk about a Ukrainian victory in Ukraine, right? If we just blow up the bridge and then Russia will collapse. They won't know what to do because they won't be able to supply their soldiers in the south, in Zaporozhye and in Kherson, as if like, they've already built a railroad, my dude, like in less than 2 years. They would find a way. Like, I don't think people understand how existential this war is for Russia. So, but it's always like, if we just hold them hostage by taking over one or two of their nuclear power plants and threatening to blow it up, like it will always require some terrorist action, or this plus a new counteroffensive somewhere will be enough to spoil the mood for the average Russian citizen, and they'll acquiesce to Ukrainian and American demands. It's not going to be like that, and it's the same thing here. Like, I mean, nobody in Iran is going to be impressed with like the crowning of this stupid king. Like,
No, no,
um,
like I said, even
I
the
mean, Iran has real issues. It has real problems. That regime is not what I would call like super secure,
no, no.
but it's also like they're willing to do certain things in order to stay in power, and it's like just witness Syria alone. Forget 2023 and 2024. You know, um, it's not just Syrians that or Iraqi Shias. You have Iranians going all the way there, like dying heroically, willing to fight against that nexus of Americans, Israelis, and some of the fanatical branches of Sunni Islam. Like they're willing to fight for that, and like I haven't seen, there would have to be mutinies and all kinds of other things. That would be like the telltale signs that something is afoot. Now, when they crack down on on the women, like the women are far more subversive. Uh, they're a barometer of their own, so to speak, about how the cultural climate might shift, right? And we'll see if there's we had the green revolution before that, then this. Both did not succeed. I don't know. It's it depends on who you talk to. The regime is probably not as weak as some people say, and not as strong as other. Although I have to say, very few people say it's super strong, anyways. Mostly, you either get people who don't know, or they'll claim the regime is very weak.
I'll put it this way:
I
if you were to show me Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, I would say those are both markedly stable regimes, despite everything. That
yeah,
they enjoy the support of their population to a large degree, and that they've created a functional state in society. The Iranians, while I wouldn't say they're dysfunctional or third world by any means, there is a lot of popular discontent with them, and a lot of that is economic issues, and the
yes,
largest degree of that can be blamed on the sanctions. But that is the name of the game when you have that kind of country that is that brazenly in opposition to the current global system, for better or for worse. And like you said, there's the women issue, there's the social liberals, there's ethnic and minority issues, which once a large reason why Pezeshkian got elected actually were a lot of these issues right here. But I do think when it comes to that, there are internal reforms that can happen within Iran that could stabilize the situation, and that if we look at the economic projections of the BRICS states, and if BRICS as an economic bloc does continue to grow, that may also lead to some relief. But I would say the main problem in Iran, not to sound too materialistic, is economic, and that a lot of those other problems grow from that. Because when the economy is doing at least decently, people tend not to think about those other issues. They tend to uh, just take it for what it is. That life is comfortable enough, and
yeah.
we can make ends meet. What more can you complain about? Is the mindset of a lot of people. And look, I know when you get into like middle class, upper middle class, a lot of those people are the ones who have the time to read about different ideologies and philosophies and get swept up in political movements. But that's going to exist in any society. That's just something that happens. Uh, but to return to your point about regime stability in Iran, even during these protests, you haven't seen. I think the bellwether for it, and I know that a lot of them are highly ideologically motivated, but you also have to keep in mind that they are an elite military force as well. When the IRGC starts to balk against the regime, I think that's when you can say uh, things are not looking good for them, where you might actually have some sort of regime change crisis. And I do think that I've touched on this before, that in Iran there is the possibility of a lot of the same quote unquote anti-Western policies continuing, and a lot of the same more uh, militaristic sentiments continuing, but with an easing up on maybe the Islamic aspect of it, more in favor of a nationalistic aspect of it. And I'll return to the point I've made once again. Part of the reason I think they killed Soleimani, not only because of his prowess as a military commander, is that I do think they feared his political prospects. And In many ways, I do think he fit the bill of that, where he wasn't a liberal by any means. He wasn't a social liberal at all, but he was less dedicated to the Islam issue, and I do think he was more of just a nationalist at heart and a militarist. And I do think that is
Yeah, he
uh,
was a nominal Muslim rather than a
yes,
devout Muslim.
yes, and I think his ideology and his beliefs were far more about the Iranian nation than any sort of Islamic beliefs. And I do
Yeah.
think that there's a significant faction of that in Iran where you could see maybe as a gradual change, maybe as a regime change, probably more likely as a gradual change, where people like those start to reflect the ruling class and maybe the mullahs fall out of favor over the course of a long period of time. And once again, those aren't the people who you're going to be able to convince to side with the West, because even despite uh, the issues with Iran, the West resulting from the Islamic Republic and the Iranian Revolution, uh, from the perspective of many Iranians who even aren't necessarily too supportive of the regime, and I don't think necessarily unjustifiably so, see the West's actions as an attack against the nation rather than against the regime, in which case that has embittered them to the West for generations to come.
Yeah, and you're seeing that even in Lebanon now. People just don't, I mean, when a country is attacked, they don't the first thing they do is not petition their government to change its mind about whatever issue that is supposed to be um uh, uh, supposed to have been the catalyst to the attack that was put on the country, right? So,
There's a reason they
I
call it the
mean, what
rallying
tends to
around the
happen,
flag effect.
right, right, and you saw it in Ukraine, you saw it in Syria, like you see it in Iran, and now you're seeing it in Lebanon, right? And as you said earlier on in the show, the um, Maronite militias, they're not there. They're gone. I mean, that was just a fixture of the '80s. That era is over.
Yeah, a lot of them emigrated, and the few that remain aren't necessarily willing to cast their lots with Israel because of what happened last time.
Yeah.
But with all that being said about the Middle East, one last thing I said I want to touch on the beginning of the show, and I do think that we have enough time to squeeze in here for the next, I don't know, 20 minutes or so, depending on how long it takes us to actually get through this topic, is some domestic news in the United States, and that is the federal government's response, or lack thereof, to Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, which is now about to impact Florida. And I'm sure you've all seen it within the past several weeks of the hurricane damage, particularly in places in Appalachia, within that real heart of Middle America, places in Western North Carolina, in West Virginia, in parts of Virginia as well. Georgia was also one of the other heavily impacted areas. South Carolina as well, the Carolinas in general, where there was massive flooding damage, and it seemed to have been a completely botched federal response. The big story that was coming out about that was the restriction of airspace to private pilots in order to send aid to these people, which the federal government was clearly failing to do. And now we have another hurricane inbound for Florida. Now, the initial forecasts for that hurricane uh, don't seem to have panned out, fortunately, where it looks like it's going to be a more moderate hurricane. It's still going to of course, it's a massive storm. It's going to do quite a bit of damage to an area of the country that, yes, admittedly is used to these storms, but it, they always do a significant amount of damage. And we'll see what actually happens when it makes landfall proper and what the results of this are uh, when everything's said and done. But focus particularly on the Helene response, where you did have this hurricane that did stretch enough to have adverse effects within these Appalachian areas. Once again, you're talking about flooding in mountains, which is a nightmare scenario just in and of itself. What we're talking about, kind of storms that we don't have on record. And I'm no meteorologist. I'm not a huge weather guy. There's a little bit that comes into play with some of the aviation stuff that I do, but that's aside the point. And it looked like, returning to that point, where there was a complete lack of federal government response. And some of the initial accusations, which I do sympathize with, and I still haven't come to the conclusion whether I agree with or not, is that the federal government has just up and left these people, that they simply do not care what happens to them. And some people go a little further and say that this is a potential for a land grab and they're trying to expel these people, maybe put these lands under federal control, or use them as a part of the resettlement programs, like we've seen in places in Ohio and other parts of the country where you do get massive amounts of migration moved in from wherever in the world, where you drop 20,000 people on a town of 60,000 and expect things to just go along as usual and tell the people to deal with it. Some people speculate that it might be part of that, where they are trying to, as part of the quote unquote relief effort, let the slate get wiped clean and then do that. Which, like I said, given the track record of the federal government, I don't think is out of the realm of possibility. I wouldn't put it past them. But this is also a region in the United States that has historically been put on the back burner when it comes to the American government's priorities. Uh, so while there is certainly the argument for some degree of malice, which I think certainly does exist, they don't like these people. They would rather do without these people. They view them as a relic of a bygone age. That a lot of the, just say, colonial stock of America can be found in a lot of these places. A lot of the heartlanded people who really do see themselves as, for lack of a term, ethnic Americans do live in these parts of the country. Like I said, they couldn't care less about these people. They are willing to let them be swept away in a flash flood.
Hmm.
Especially when you look at North Carolina, which is the site of massive military installations who certainly do have the resources. That is Fort Bragg, or whatever they renamed it now as part of whatever diversity push that they're doing, and the Marine base Camp Lejeune also. And like I said, these are bases massive with the resources to conduct rescue efforts. We've seen the mobilization of National Guardsmen across several states being sent to aid in this effort in very much a too little, too late sort of way. You compare that to the response to the last major hurricane, or the last, at least on this scale, Katrina. You had guardsmen on the ground a couple days before the situation actually did take a turn for the worse. And Katrina's response was horribly botched, and a lot of people lost a lot of confidence in the federal government because of that. Bush's approval rating went just completely plummeted as a result of that, and that was on top of the foreign policy blunders at his time, and of course the impending 2008 economic crisis, which really broke the Republican Party in that upcoming election. And it is relevant, especially considering that this is an election year, and that it's a rather contentious election year at that. And one of the candidates running, of course, is second in command of the administration, which does uh, lead to a lot of questions, and does about disaster response especially. But FEMA, which is the target of many quote unquote conspiracy theories, all not all of which I think are ridiculous, some of which I do, but certainly a target worthy of criticism, seems to be nowhere to be found. And this is supposed to be the crisis response team of the federal government in these sort of emergencies. And you could argue the most basic function of a state is crisis mitigation first and foremost, whether that be in the form of political crisis, economic crisis, foreign crisis that affects your country, or in this case, a natural disaster. The primary role of the state is to, you can't always prevent it, you can't always stop it, but to mitigate it. And so far,
Hmm.
it looks like the federal government is missing in action. The state governments are doing what they can with the resources that they have, but once again, compare the resources inside of the state governments to the federal governments, it's not even a competition. There's only so much they can do. And uh, I think you are looking at, with this right here, while I don't write off some degree of malice, and there probably is some sort of disdain for the people affected as a result of this, uh, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that the federal government is simply not capable of launching the kind of relief effort that it would have even a decade ago. I mean, I know Hurricane Sandy that hit the Northeast wasn't as bad as, say, Katrina, or as bad as now, but even the response to Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, New York, was somewhat competent, and that was 2013, I believe. I think it was 2012, 2013. But just a decade later, 12 years later, 11, 12 years later, that simply doesn't exist anymore. And I do think a lot of that is, of course, the military, the National Guard, they do get mobilized to deal with these sort of issues. Is that the apparatus of the American Empire is simply falling into disrepair in many ways. not
Yeah.
only in terms of military, but look at the hundreds of billions of dollars of damage that has been done by these storms alone. How much will the reconstruction efforts cost? How much will be allocated to these states, to these localities that had that? Will they? I mean, American infrastructure is already in a sorry state as it is, and it's been a constant fight to get that funded. I know one of Trump's first big acts, which you can give him some credit for, was trying to push through infrastructure spending that didn't really amount to anything, but once again, something that we all collectively as a nation at least pay lip service to the fact that infrastructure needs repaired. But this adds even more weight and more pressure on a structure that's already not up to code. And the question is, at what point does this sort of damage become irreparable? I know that people make a big deal about bridges and the quality and safety of bridges these days, but we're talking about, once again, through the heartland of America, small towns across it, even some larger towns. Asheville, Carolina, not a huge city, but it was one of those cities that was most adversely affected by this. But that's also talking about transportation routes as well, highways, railroads, etc. Will the federal government in 2024, even the state governments for that matter, given the level of competence they have, given the level of, let's just say, care that they actually even have about this issue, have we fallen into a position where a significant amount of American infrastructure is now in a state of disrepair? I know it might be early to talk about this, but looking at the impacts on some of these parts of the country, do you think that they're going to be able to launch the relief and reconstruction efforts that, like I said, they launched even just a decade ago in the Northeast?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like they don't want them there. Now, I've heard some theories, that there's lithium there. I don't know. I know that in 1947, American planes steered like a hurricane by having planes circle around it or something to that effect, and um, the government had to pay retribution. I read this somewhere this week only because I have friends who are very much into this. I don't know what the motive is. Like if this now this is hilarious, but there was a headline I saw today. I don't know whether it was Time magazine or not, or the New York Times, but it said no, Hurricane Milton is not engineered or was not engineered by the government or whatever. I do love it when signs of loss of faith in institutions continues to grow.
Yeah, oh, yes, that's always
That that's
one
it's,
thing
it's
that we
always
can look at.
comforting.
But
But I don't know what would be the motive, right? Like I know on Twitter, like you have shit libs that are gleeful just to know that this is happening to them, even though places like Asheville, my friend has been to Asheville. He he surmised that from the time that he spent there, that it was pretty much a liberal town. Yeah, it's in the Appalachians, and maybe that's out of the ordinary, but that town isn't like super conservative. Um,
but I mean,
so I don't know. I don't know. I think incompetence explains more.
yes.
There was a hurricane or a tornado that happened in the Mediterranean several years ago. That's more inexplicable. But like some hurricanes have gone off course, and gone up the Appalachians. They're not that far from the coast, right?
No,
Like
no, not at all.
it's conceivable.
I mean, we haven't gotten anything to even compare to any hurricane damage, but even here, somewhere like in Ohio, we get little break off thunderstorms that hit us.
Yeah.
Um,
Same with us. We've had a few tornadoes, but they're nothing like the ones in the States. Now, way back about 20, 30 years, no, more like close to 30 years ago, we had one just north of the city where I am. But uh, yeah. But why
okay,
don't
but
you show the
because you
the the,
posted,
the FEMA director?
we have to show you the
I
director of
sent you.
FEMA.
I saw it. Now you have to see it.
I suppose I should
Do you know
wait.
she went to Israel this week?
Of course
The-
she
the-
did.
Isn't that crazy?
Wow, wow, that's I wonder what the motive for that could have been. But no, I'm actually glad you made me put this up because I think it dovetails in my next point perfectly. I think
Hmm.
what you could best describe the response to this crisis as incompetence with a healthy mix of disdain.
Yes. Yeah.
Where even if they wanted to, they probably couldn't, but they aren't going to make this their priority, especially not in an election year, especially not in Red America. And that, like I said, they might not be as gleeful as, say, Twitter journalists, but their level of disdain does take over to a degree where maybe they'll smirk about it, or
Yeah.
maybe they'll say like, oh, "That's what you get for voting for Trump." I mean, the level of superstition these people adopt, especially in times of natural disasters, puts the ancient pagans to shame.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
and that's really like, but if only you had agreed with my 21st century liberal politics, you would not have incurred the wrath of Mother Nature. They always love to pull that one out. Where,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
like I said, it puts the superstition of ancient tribal pagans to shame. That's what it feels like, and especially with a lot of the hurricanes that hit, yeah, these parts of Red America. And 2017, 2018, you did have some hurricanes under Trump that they like to do this. Now, of course, when it hits Puerto Rico, it's a tragedy, and when the local authorities in Puerto Rico botch the response, it's directly Donald Trump's fault. Uh, Notice how the narrative changes, or when it hits New Orleans, it's George Bush's fault. I'm not trying to absolve George Bush here of anything, but once again, we all notice the shift in narratives right there. Uh, but I mean, what else can you really say about these people? And I think that from incompetence, malice, whatever it may be, ultimately we're going to have irreparable damage done to large swaths of the country, and it's going to be a black mark on America's reputation to its own population. The fact that
Yeah.
the state could not fulfill its most basic responsibility of crisis mitigation, which I maintain is the most basic responsibility of the state. And what do they do
It's
for that?
why you pay taxes.
Why do you pay taxes? And I think the response of the state and local governments would be paramount in terms to determine what political discourse and what the just political climate of America will look like in the future. Now, DeSantis, who I of course could say plenty about. I have a lot of gripes with him for many reasons. To his credit, does seem to have organized a competent, at least preparation for a response in Florida. We'll see what happens when push comes to shove. We'll see what happens when the storms actually make landfall and the response has to be carried out. But if he can pull off a good state level response, that could drastically change the political culture in America, where you have these people in North Carolina who were uh, up and left by the federal government, whereas you have these people in Florida whose state government was able to pull off a successful response effort. And it does bring back that question: why do you pay taxes? Why do you do any of this? Why do you grovel before a regime that is not able to fulfill its most basic responsibilities? And I'll say once again for the record, I'm not advocating anything. I don't want anything to happen. I'm not encouraging anyone to any sort of action at all. But these are the sentiments that it does plant in people. And some people have gone as far as to call this an American Chernobyl. I don't think that's a fair comparison. But it has been said of a crisis by the state, uh, mismanaged by the state, that breaks the confidence of the government. Now, even to return to Chernobyl, the Soviet government, even in the 80s, even as if it was in its last years, was able to organize actually a pretty orderly evacuation from the
Hmm.
surrounding areas. And while, yes, there were effects and there were environmental effects, and it's still a complete no go zone in terms of uh, environmental concerns, uh, the crisis was mitigated to a far greater degree than I think anyone could have really expected. Now, I think the
Mm.
cause for the crisis in the first place did bring up questions. Now, it's fun when people talk about Chernobyl, and I don't want to get off too much tangent about this. they're always eager to blame the Soviet government as a whole, which, yeah, okay, obviously. But they never want to bring up the particularities of blaming the government of the Ukrainian SSR and who was in charge of the Ukrainian
Right,
SSR.
right.
Yeah, they'll never say it was the local party bosses in Ukraine who botched that project, and they'll never tell you the ethnicity of those local party bosses. And you've seen this shift in recent years where clearly the Russians destroyed one of their own power plants just to get at the Ukrainians who they already controlled.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I mean, how many hospitals or bridges have been built in Ukraine since '91? You know?
Yeah, but like I said, that's not a tangent I wanted to get off on, but it is a
Yeah,
comparison people have made. And like I said, I'll ultimately need to see more details about the federal government's response or lack thereof to both Helene and Milton to determine what will come of this, and maybe there's a higher degree of malice than I assign to it. Maybe I'm being a bit naive here, but regardless, it's a real damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for the federal government, where they do not come out looking good, no matter how you spin this.
yeah. Like I say, it's incompetence, and it's also certain groups that the country is so divided that these groups always evaluate these situations about, well, does it hurt my group? Um, and those have been the trends the last 10 years: loss of faith in institutions and divisions, and also those divisions are such that one group seems to get uh, more for its tax money than the other.
Could you say that this group possibly pays in less? Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it does seem like a lopsided tax burden, and I think it does beg the question of of a lot of very productive people in America. Well, what the hell's going on? And like I said, I think after a certain point, we just need to hold our comments, hold our analysis to actually figure out what this is going to look like in a week's time, in a month's time. And I do have to say this is one of those things where we touched briefly on the election, but I do think that given this, it does make a Trump victory look more likely. That, of course, like I said, I don't think that weather modification or weather control is a possibility. I don't think it's something that's like absurdly impossible, but I don't think it's a capability that we have right now. And of course, it's something that uh, military intelligence agencies, if they could, they would desire to do something like this. I'm not saying it's something that they would just have
Hmm.
some sort
Hmm.
of moral outrage. We would never do that, or some sort of practical consideration of what use would that be. No, they would love nothing more than to have these mechanisms. They probably are researching night and day on how to do stuff like this. But like I said,
Yeah.
for the time being, I don't think that capability exists to any significant degree. I'll just put it that way. Um, but getting to my ultimate point here, obviously, it is a natural disaster for a reason. But it does seem like the events that have happened over the past month and a half, both domestically and abroad, lend itself to the idea that Trump is being prepared to reassume power. Like I said, I know I touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the show, but I want to return to it. And I do think that with some of the coverage from some segments of the media on the hurricane, while they won't outright criticize Biden, while they won't outright criticize Harris, of course, they won't give them the defense that, say, they would have given to the Obama administration just 12 years
Hmm.
ago,
Hmm.
where they will softly throw them under the bus, and they will, in a way, pave the way for Trump to return to office. And I think this is the most recent example of that. And this is less than a month from election. By the time this premieres, I believe it'll be 25 days before election day in the United States, and already the betting markets are looking slightly positive towards Trump. The polls are neck and neck as always, and the polls you always need to take with a healthy dose of salt, I'll say. Uh, but even that, it looks some shaky if you believe the reports of the internal polls in some of the key swing states like Arizona, like the upper Midwest. And even some people are calling Virginia into question right now. And I do think I need to wait until we're a couple weeks out before the election to actually make a concrete prediction, which I will. I will make a concrete prediction probably a couple weeks before election day that I will present on the show. And I'll probably be wrong about quite a few things, like I was last time. That's bound to happen. I'm not a huge electoral guy, hugely into electoral politics. But we'll have to see. But I do think that, regardless of anyone's personal preference, I think that everyone on the show either is pro-Trump or just staying their hand this time. I don't think there's any Kamala supporters out here listening, unless you're a hardcore accelerationist, in which case I don't agree with you, but I'd like to hear your case.
Hmm.
Certainly, and please do tell me in the comments if you do fall under that perspective. But putting all personal biases aside, I think that uh, the conditions just domestically and globally are favoring Trump.
Yeah. I mean, it is a great point. Trump is going to, like, I don't know if you've noticed, Kamala doesn't seem,
To exist.
yes, her star is kind of fading. Um, I think this disaster has worked for Trump. The feeling is Trump wouldn't have allowed this would have responded much more quickly. And if he had been president all along, he wouldn't have had to engineer a hurricane that would crash into this area. So he would have.
And regardless of whether or not any of that is true, including your most recent statement, that is the public perception, which is what matters.
I know. Remember, he hired this amazing marksman to graze him on his ear. Like,
Remember when he suggested nuking the hurricane?
yeah, I know. If he can just keep us out of a war, and he keeps talking crap like that, I'm happy.
Nuke the hurricane, not Iran. That's my stance. It's the path to world peace. If all the world's nuclear powers just got together and signed a treaty that we will nuke whatever hurricane comes up, nuclear
Yeah.
disarmament would be done in a decade. Um, but yeah, I agree with you. I look, being in a safe red state. I'll be honest. We're less than a month out of election day. I still haven't made up my mind whether I'm going to bite the bullet for Trump or whether I'm just going to stay out of this.
Yeah.
I'll be perfectly honest. And like I said, what I do doesn't really matter. Ohio's going red anyway. So I might just stay out of it, just to not have to think about it. But I don't know. If I lived in a swing state, I probably would vote for Trump. I'll be honest. But I do agree with your assessment. If he can just keep on saying things like nuke the hurricanes and not start a war and not do like,
I'm gonna buy Greenland.
yeah,
There's nothing you
and
can
I'm
do
gonna
about
buy
it.
Greenland and not like do a massive screw up on immigration. Like I'll take what I can get, but like I said, a lot of that remains to be seen. And I'm hoping for the better outcome, but I'm expecting the worst as always.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's all I had. Unless you have any last minute things.
No, I don't actually. I think that's about it.
And we made it to the finish line of yet another episode of the War Report. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back sooner rather than later, of course.
Yeah.
See you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thank you, and take care, guys.